Good morning, y'all. I want to talk to you this morning about something that is already happening in the atmosphere right now. Something that is going to affect the air you breathe, the sky above your head, the health of millions of people across the southern United States, and the trajectory of the Atlantic hurricane season over the next week and beyond. A massive surge of Saharan dust is on the way. And I want to be honest with you from the very first sentence about what that means and what it does not mean, because Saharan dust is one of those weather phenomena that gets covered in two completely opposite ways. Either as a pretty sunset curiosity that meteorologists mention in passing between the real weather stories, or as a sensationalized vague cloud from Africa is coming headline that tells people very little about what is actually happening or why it matters. I'm going to do neither of those things this morning. Because the dust surge that is building and beginning to arrive right now is larger than anything we have seen in this region so far. This year, it has real and serious implications for air quality and public health across a broad corridor of the country, and it carries a meaning for the tropical Atlantic that I think is critically important context for anyone who has been watching this hurricane season closely. So let us get into the real data, all of it, and I will tell you exactly what you need to know. What is actually happening right now? The current state of the plume. Let me start with where things stand as of this morning, because this is not a dust event that is still somewhere over the Atlantic. The leading edge of this surge is already on American soil. The first major push of Saharan dust began arriving in South Florida on Wednesday, July 8th. And as you watch this video, it is already spreading northward into northern parts of the Florida peninsula today and into Friday. That is not a forecast. That is current, observed, confirmed dust in the lower atmosphere over the Sunshine State right now. The Washington Post covered the arrival on July 8th. Local 10 News in Miami, which tracks Saharan dust coverage extensively because Florida gets some of the most direct and most frequent dust exposure of any state in the country, is specifically flagging that this first push is just the opening act. Because here's where this gets significant. A second, thicker surge of Saharan dust is expected to arrive over Florida's peninsula this weekend and potentially reach the coastal areas of Texas by next Tuesday into Wednesday, July 15th to 16th. And the NASA Goddard Earth Observing System model, GEOS 5, which is one of the most sophisticated atmospheric aerosol tracking models in the world, and which the scientific and meteorological community relies on heavily for Saharan dust forecasting, is tracking the surge from early July 8th through early July 13th as a major expansive event covering an enormous swath of the tropical North Atlantic and pushing into the Gulf and southeastern United States. Now here is the most important number I want to give you about this surge, because it puts its magnitude in immediate context. Through the first week of July, the dust-heavy part of the tropical North Atlantic, the region east of the Caribbean islands and west of Africa, where Saharan dust concentrations are typically measured, actually recorded its lowest dust concentrations to date this season. The dust had been relatively light. The Atlantic had a brief window of reduced suppression. But this week, according to Local 10's hurricane specialist Michael Lowry, the incoming surge is expected to top the levels observed during what had been the most concentrated dust outbreak of the year, the outbreak that occurred during the week of February 15th. Let me say that again. The dust surge arriving right now is expected to be the strongest of the entire year so far. Not the strongest of the summer, the strongest of the year. And it is arriving in a south and southeast United States that is already dealing with oppressive heat, degraded air quality from the ongoing heat dome, and populations that are heat stressed from 2 consecutive weeks of extraordinary temperatures. What the Saharan air layer actually is, why it matters so much. Y'all, I want to spend real time explaining the Saharan air layer, the SAL, because I think most people have a mental image of Saharan dust as a decorative weather phenomenon, a bit of orange haze and a pretty sunset. And that mental image significantly underrepresents what this air mass actually is and what it does when it arrives. The Saharan air layer forms over the Sahara Desert through a very specific process. The intense daytime heating over the desert surface lifts fine sand and dust particles off the ground and into the lower and middle levels of the atmosphere. Atmospheric disturbances, the same kind of easterly waves that eventually become tropical storms when they find favorable environments, pick up that dust-laden air and carry it westward off the African coast and out over the tropical North Atlantic. Once the SAL moves off the African coast, it rides over a cooler, moisture layer of air near the ocean surface, and a temperature inversion forms at the base of the dust layer that keeps it intact and separated from the surface air below. This inversion essentially insulates the SAL from below and allows it to travel thousands of miles across the Atlantic, sometimes more than 6,000 miles from the African coast to the Gulf of Mexico and beyond, while maintaining its fundamental character: dry, dusty, warm, and hostile to tropical development. The SAL carries 3 specific properties that make it one of the most powerful natural suppressors of tropical cyclone development in the Atlantic basin. The first is extreme dryness. The air within the Saharan air layer has roughly 50% less moisture than a typical tropical atmospheric environment. When that dry air gets entrained into a developing tropical system, it causes the thunderstorm towers to evaporate before they can reach full depth, cutting off the convective engine that a tropical cyclone needs to organize and intensify. The second is strong internal winds. Within the SAL itself, winds can run from 25 to 55 miles per hour. Internal shear that shreds any tropical circulation trying to develop within or near the layer. And the third is warmth. The SAL is anomalously warm relative to the ambient atmospheric temperature at the same altitude, and that warmth stabilizes the air and makes cloud formation genuinely difficult in the regions it covers. Put those 3 properties together, and what you have is a traveling atmospheric wall, 6,000 miles wide, spreading from the African coast to the Americas, that suppresses tropical development for weeks at a time across the entire Atlantic basin. And the surge arriving right now is the strongest the basin has seen all year. The air quality threat. The immediate public health story. Y'all, while the hurricane implications of this dust surge are significant, and I am going to get to them in a moment, I want to make sure I spend real time on the public health story first. Because the air quality impacts of a major Saharan dust surge on the southern United States are real, they are measurable, and for millions of people they are genuinely dangerous. Round after round of Saharan dust pushing into the south and southeast United States over the next week is going to be the primary air quality story for that entire region. The concern is not the visible haze. The orange-tinted skies and the dulled sunlight are visually striking, but they are not in themselves dangerous. The concern is the invisible component of that dust, fine particulate matter, PM2. 5, particles smaller than 2.5 micrometers in diameter, is the category of airborne particles that penetrates deepest into the lungs, and that poses the most significant health risk to vulnerable populations. Saharan dust is rich in fine particulate matter, and when a major dust surge pushes into the Gulf Coast and southeast, PM2. 5 concentrations in the affected areas can rise into the unhealthy range on the air quality index, sometimes into the very unhealthy range, for days at a time. Who is most at risk from elevated PM2? 5 concentrations? People with asthma. People with COPD and other chronic obstructive lung diseases, people with heart disease and cardiovascular conditions, pregnant women, children whose lungs are still developing and who are more sensitive to particulate matter exposure than adults, the elderly, outdoor workers who cannot choose to stay inside during the hours of highest dust concentration, and anyone in the affected area who is going to be spending extended time outdoors over the coming week, which during the summer in the south is an enormous number of people. The guidance for the coming week across Florida, coastal Texas, and the broader Gulf Coast is straightforward. Monitor your local air quality index daily. The EPA's AirNow website and its associated app provide real-time AQI data for every county in the country, and checking it in the morning before you decide how much time you or your children are going to spend outdoors is a genuinely important habit during a major dust event. On days when the AQI is in the unhealthy for sensitive groups range or above, which is going to happen repeatedly across this corridor over the next week, people with respiratory or cardiovascular conditions should limit their outdoor time, keep their windows closed, and run HVAC systems on recirculate rather than drawing in outside air. Children who participate in outdoor summer activities should have their exposure limited on the worst air quality days. And outdoor workers need to be aware that extended exposure to elevated fine particulate matter is a real occupational health hazard, and that dust-rated respirators are genuinely protective in the highest concentration situations. The hurricane season implications, both sides of the story. Now let me talk about what this dust surge means for the Atlantic hurricane season, because this is the question I know is on the mind of everyone who has been following the tropics closely this summer, and the answer has 2 important sides that I want to make sure you hear completely. The short-term implication of this massive Saharan dust surge is straightforward, and it is good news for Gulf Coast and East Coast communities in the near term. The dust is suppressing tropical development across the entire Atlantic basin right now. The tropical waves that are currently moving westward through the basin, the 2 waves I covered in recent updates, are moving through an environment that has been dramatically hostile to development as a result of this dust surge. The dry air, the internal shear within the SAL, and the atmospheric stabilization the warm dust layer creates are all working simultaneously to prevent any of these waves from organizing into a named tropical cyclone. The National Hurricane Center's continued assessment that no tropical cyclone formation is expected in the next 7 days is directly connected to the presence and the magnitude of this dust surge in the basin. On that timescale, the dust is protective. But here is the other side of the story, and it is the side that I want Gulf Coast communities to hold on to beyond the next week. Saharan dust surges are temporary, they are episodic. The African continent generates them in waves, and between the major surge events, the dust concentration in the Atlantic drops, and the environment becomes more favorable for tropical development. The surge arriving this weekend is the strongest of the year, but it will peak, and it will begin to erode. The question that matters for the Gulf Coast is not whether this surge suppresses development this week. It clearly will. The question is what the basin looks like on the other side of this surge, in the 2 to 3 week window after the peak dust concentrations pass and the atmosphere reloads with the tropical moisture and wave energy that has been backing up in the pipeline behind the SAL. Because here is what is also true about the current situation in the Atlantic. The sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico and the Western Caribbean remain above average. The tropical wave pipeline off the African coast has not stopped generating waves. And the El Niño-related wind shear that has been the other suppressing factor this season is not permanent. When a major dust surge erodes, when the basin clears in its wake, the waves that have been struggling through a hostile environment sometimes emerge into a dramatically more favorable one. Forecasters call this a burst of activity following a quiet period. And the history of the Atlantic hurricane season shows that some of the most rapid and unexpected storm developments have occurred in the wake of extended dust suppression periods, precisely because the waves that survived the hostile environment were the ones organized enough to persist and then take advantage of the improved conditions when the dust cleared. I am not telling you a hurricane is coming after this dust clears. I am telling you that the period 2 to 3 weeks from now deserves your attention, and that using the quiet week that this dust surge is buying the Gulf Coast to complete your hurricane preparedness is one of the best investments of time and energy you can make right now. What to do right now? Y'all, let me close with the specific, actionable things I need you to do over the next week based on everything I have just told you. If you have asthma, COPD, heart disease, or any other respiratory or cardiovascular condition, download the AirNow app right now and set it to your location. Check the AQI every morning before you go outside. On any day that hits unhealthy for sensitive groups or above, stay inside with your windows closed and your air filter or HVAC running. This is not an abundance of caution. It is a direct, evidence-based health recommendation for a major particulate matter event. If you have children participating in outdoor summer programs, sports, or activities in Florida, the Gulf Coast, or the Southeast over the next week, talk to the program coordinators about air quality protocols. On the worst dust days, outdoor activity for children should be limited. If you are a Gulf Coast resident and you have been putting off your hurricane preparedness work because the season has been quiet, please use this window that the dust surge is buying you. Know your evacuation zone, build your supply kit, have your family plan. Because this dust clears eventually, the wave pipeline behind it is full and the Gulf water is warm. And share this video with everyone you know in Florida, Texas, and the Gulf Coast Southeast, because the Saharan dust story is the kind of story that saves people, health impacts, and hospital visits when it reaches the right people before the dust does. Closing. Y'all, a massive Saharan dust surge is arriving now. The first push is already in South Florida as you watch this video. The thicker second surge arrives this weekend and potentially reaches coastal Texas by next Tuesday. This week's surge is expected to be the strongest of the entire year. Air quality impacts are real and serious for vulnerable populations across a broad corridor of the South and Southeast. And on the other side of this surge, 2 to 3 weeks from now, the Atlantic hurricane season's quiet window will close, and the preparation work you do right now will matter. I am going to be right here tracking both the dust and the tropics every single day. Subscribe and ring that notification bell. Share this video, stay inside on the bad air quality days if you are in a sensitive group. And as always, stay safe out there. I love y'all.